Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
Romanov wrote in his memoir that he would have to write a letter directly to Stalin anytime Soviet athletes competed internationally, guaranteeing that the Soviets would win.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. I speak with Bruce Berglund, the author of the Moscow Playbook, How Russia Used, Abused and Transformed Sports in the Hunt for Gold, which is a fascinating journey through the world of Soviet sports and its intricate ties to politics as a means of soft power and national pride. We learn how the Soviets achieved strategic advantage through women's sports, the abuse of amateur status, doping, and how sports science revolutionised the performance of athletes. Listeners will also hear about the iconic Miracle on Ice hockey game in 1980, where a US amateur team defeated the seasoned Soviet professionals. I'm delighted to welcome Bruce Berglund to our Cold War conversation.
So the Moscow Playbook, there's not a physical playbook in the Kremlin with strategies that Moscow uses in its relations with governing bodies and so forth. But I use this device, this literary device, because in the course of my research, I did see, consistent strategies and approaches and deceptions that Soviet leaders and then Russian leaders since 1991 have used in dealing with the International Olympic Committee, as well as the other governing bodies, the federations of various world sports, not only in terms of gaining an advantage for Soviet and then Russian athletes, but also in deceiving or directing attention away from some of the dirty tricks that they were using in competition to gain an upper hand. The Moscow Playbook has various pieces of, as I say, various strategies, both in terms of how to train and develop winning athletes, Olympic level, champion level athletes, as well as how to, as I said, to deal with governing bodies and to cover up some of the less savory things that the Soviets and the Russians have done over the years.
And we'll have a look at those as we go through this interview. When did the Soviet Union see sport as like a soft power option? Was it in Stalin's era, or was he not a fan?
So it was during Stalin's era. So we can't really call Stalin a sports fan, though. The decision to have the Soviet Union participate in international sport came right after the end of the Second World War. In the opening chapter of my book, I talk about this tour by the top Soviet football club, Dynamo Moscow, when they visited Britain. This was in November 1945, so just shortly after the war ended. And this is one of the most famous early instances of Soviet athletes competing against top athletes from the West. And it was in the years after this, in the late 1940s and then the early 1950s, that the Soviets began to engage more with the international sport federations and began to participate in international competition, culminating with their participation in the 1952 Olympics. Now, prior to this point, prior to the war, so between the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and the Second World War, there was a thriving sport culture in the Soviet Union. However, the Soviets did not participate in international competitions. They were not a member of the International Olympic Committee. They were not members of FIFA, so they didn't participate in the World Cup. There were friendlies between particularly Soviet football clubs and European clubs, but in terms of major competitions, the Soviets saw those or branded those as bourgeois capitalist events, and they refused to take part. So Soviet sport is really wound up in the beginnings of the Cold War, the early tensions immediately after the end of the Second World War. And this was a way the Soviets saw themselves now as a world power. After their armies were in Berlin, Stalin had been meeting with Roosevelt, with British leaders and so forth. And so sport was another way that the Soviet leadership saw that they could demonstrate their standing and also demonstrate the superiority of Soviet communism as a social and economic system.
So how does that Dynamo Moscow tour go?
The Soviets do not drop a match. They played teams in England, Wales, as well as in Scotland. And so they went the Soviet way in that they didn't lose. And when the Soviets began to be involved in world sport already with this tour, the directive that came, and this came all the way from Stalin. So, as I said, Stalin wasn't much of a sport fan, but he did have a requirement for Soviet athletes when they went out into the world, and that was they must win, or more importantly, they must not lose. And so, in that respect, when the Soviets came to Britain to play this series of friendlies against English, Welsh, and Scottish clubs, they came away without a loss. And so, in the pages of the Soviet press, when they returned, this was announced as a victorious tour. It showed the superiority of the Soviet system. It showed the superiority of the collective strategy of Soviet football as opposed to the individualistic strategy of the West. And so, yeah, this was heralded as a great success. And above all, the Soviets did not embarrass themselves or embarrass Stalin by coming away with a loss.
How does this affect their view of sport? Because you mentioned a moment ago that they did have a team at the 1952 Olympics. Did they join the IOC shortly after that?
So there was a push within the Soviet leadership. And I should say the push came from sports authorities. And one of the things I should say from the start, that sport, like other facets of society and the economy in the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, sport was organized, it was administered by a central committee that provided the funding or directed the funding as well as directed policy down to the lower levels. So in Moscow, you had the state sport committee. It was led by, after the war, it was led by a party apparatchik named Nikolai Romanov, who had not been an athlete. He was simply a rising party member. He was put in charge of sport policy. So you have this committee that is directing sport policy. They would communicate directives down to the club level and so forth. And it was in this sport apparatus, which is just developing after the war, that you have coaches, you have trainers, and so forth. And they're the ones who are really putting pressure on the top leadership, the political leadership, to participate first in the 1948 Olympics. And it was Romanov as well who reported directly to the Politburo. And Romanov was suggesting that the Soviet Union was in a place that they would be prepared to participate in 1948. The political leadership recognized, no, this is not the case. Back to what I was saying earlier, Stalin had this mandate that not only with the Olympics, but anytime Soviet athletes competed internationally, that they had to win. And Romanov wrote in his memoir that he would have to write a letter directly to Stalin anytime Soviet athletes competed overseas, competed internationally, guaranteeing that the Soviets would win. And there's a great line in Romanov's memoirs, which were published during Perestroika. Romanov said, "Whenever I did this, there was some anxiety in my soul when having to make this promise to Stalin." So Romanov as well recognized that this is going to be difficult to guarantee victories to Stalin. And for a brief time, Romanov even lost his job. I think it was the speed skaters came up short in the European Championships, and Romanov was sacked for a few years. So the leadership wanted to make sure before the Soviets competed in the Olympics that they would be in a position to win. So they skipped the 1948 Summer and Winter Olympics, and then they prepared to participate not in the 1952 Winter Olympics. Romanov recognized that winter athletes were not ready yet, but instead they concentrated their efforts on the 1952 Summer Games in Helsinki. So this was the first time the Soviet Union competed.
And how did they fare there? Did Romanov have to worry further?
Romanov did have to worry further, but he put his finger on the scales to make sure that the Soviets would come away victorious. And this is a terrific story in the book, and it comes from both Romanov's memoir as well as research that was done by Russian historians and journalists later on. Back at this time, as far back as the 1930s into the 50s, the winning nation of the Olympics was not determined simply by the medal table, right? Who won the most gold medals, who had the most total medals. Instead, and this was done in multiple countries, there was a point system whereby a gold medal earned so many points, and they would go down not simply to bronze, but all the way to sixth place. So the sixth place finisher would merit a point in these totals. So this was the case in the United States. American newspapers would track how the Americans were doing relative to other nations by this point system. And so Romanov adopted this similar tally, but he adjusted the math a little bit. And one of the changes he made at the Soviets in 1952, even though it was their first Olympics, they sent the largest team of any nation to Helsinki. So they had the largest number of athletes, but Romanov knew that the Soviets could not compete with the US in terms of winning gold medals. But the Soviets would, because of the size of their team, likely pack a number of people placing in the top six. So he adjusted the formula to give less weight to winners of gold medals and adjust it so that the top six finishers, it would be more balanced. According to his system, the Soviets ended up coming in second in terms of the medal table to the United States. The Soviets finished with 22 gold medals compared to 40 by the US. And with total medals, it was much closer. The US had 76 total medals. The Soviets had 71. But in this point system, according to Romanov's math, the Soviet Union barely eked out a victory over the United States. 494 points for the Soviets as opposed to 490 for the Americans. And still, Romanov tells this story in his memoirs of how he went back to Moscow to report the result of this tally to the Politburo. And once again, he had some anxiety, and he was assured by Molenkov that, no, you've done good work, comrade. We have more work to do in the future, but this was a good outing. Go home and, he literally said, go home and take a rest after this successful first run.
Wow. Wow. I can imagine his nerves before that Politburo meeting. So the Soviets realized they've got to be almost like strategic about how they approach, particularly these big tournaments like the Olympics. And they notice that the West don't really take women's sport seriously.
Correct. And so I talk about Romanov as really an important figure, and a figure who's barely known at all in the West, and certainly not in history writing on the Soviet Union. But he's really a key figure in building the Soviet sport apparatus. And I write in the book that if we look at the history of the Soviet Union, it's international sport where the Soviets were probably most successful during the course of the Cold War. Where international sport was something where the Soviets accomplished what they set out to be dominant, to show the superiority of their system. They influenced sport around the world, which is something I discuss in the book. And one of these areas where Romanov recognized this is a weakness of the West, an opportunity for us, the Soviets, to take advantage of this weakness, but also an area where the Soviets made a lasting contribution to world sport, was in recognizing or emphasizing women athletes and women's participation in international events. And we do have the memoranda, the reports that Romanov prepared in his arguments for the Soviets to participate in the Olympics and other international events. And he wrote explicitly, women's sport is an area where we can pull ahead of the United States and of the West because they give this little regard. And I talk about this in my book. I focus in particular on women's gymnastics, which was now in the Olympics, Summer Olympics. Women's gymnastics is one of the most popular events, certainly in the United States. Women's gymnastics gains the most television coverage, the highest ratings every 4 years. In 1952, this was not the case. In Western Europe, in North America, women's gymnastics was not the popular sport that it is today. Women's gymnastics and gymnastics as a whole is something that comes out of more of a Central European tradition. It comes out of the German tradition. It had been popular in Russia. So now we have the sport that's introduced to the Olympics. And 1952 was the first time that you had men's and women's artistic gymnastics. And the Soviets right away recognized this as a place where we can get medals. And I profile in the book an early Soviet gymnast. She first participated in 1956, Larissa Latinina, who ended up in the 1956, 60, and 64 Olympics. She ended up being the most decorated Olympian up to that point. It was not until Michael Phelps at the London Olympics that someone broke her record for having the most gold medals and the most total medals. And Latinina just represents the dominance that the Soviets had from 1952 to the last Olympics the Soviet Union participated in 1988 in women's gymnastics, as well as men's gymnastics. This was the case where Romanov recognized his strategy really bore fruit in emphasizing women's sport, in particular gymnastics, but in other areas as well. The Soviets always advocated to the International Olympic Committee for the expansion of women's events in the Olympics because they knew we stand a chance to win medals.
And I think you describe Latinina being at the 2012 Olympics and actually seeing her record being broken.
Yeah, she was there at poolside when Michael Phelps broke her record for total medals. And she was quite popular at the 2012 games in London. She was doing interviews. She was this little Russian grandma. And at the time she said, "Oh, Phelps is a great athlete. He deserves the record." And she did remark as well, "I was nowhere near as popular back when I was competing as I am now," which is a reflection on how women's gymnastics has become this hugely popular part of the Olympics. And there we have to give tribute as well to the Soviets, is that they really, not only with Latinina, but then with Olga Korbut, they brought gymnastics to the world's attention.
Indeed. And I think the Western press, or is it the US press, take quite a dim view of her in the 1950s.
The Western, yes, so we'll emphasize the American press. The American press took a dim view not only of Latina, let me clarify. The Western press loved Larissa Latinina. They loved Soviet women gymnasts. The Soviet gymnastics team, both the men and the women, made a goodwill tour of the United States. This was in 1961. And reporters, New York Times and other regional newspapers, the big national news magazines, they commented on this tour. And they were impressed with the male gymnasts, with the feats of strength and so forth. But they really loved the women gymnasts because the women's gymnastics team defied all of the prejudices and stereotypes that American sports writers had about Soviet women athletes. Other than the gymnastics athletes, the American press commented on Soviet women as being these burly, not very attractive peasant women who would give the Soviet Union an advantage by winning events like the javelin and the hammer throw and things like this. So there was this stereotype that, and you had American sports writers who made the charge that the Soviets had this unfair advantage because their female athletes were busy pushing plows and hauling bricks. And therefore, they had the strength to win these events, as one journalist said, in the biceps division. Whereas in the kinds of sports that emphasized, as they said in the language of the times, feminine charms, such as swimming, such as long distance running and so forth, the American women were still on top. So the Soviet gymnastics team comes to the United States and they completely overturn all of these stereotypes of burly, unattractive, husky Soviet peasant women who compete in hammer throw and other events. And so Soviet writers, they loved Larissa Latinina. They loved her teammates. They wrote about their attractiveness. They wrote about their marital status. There were a lot of interesting quotes in the stories covering this tour from male spectators who were astonished by Soviet female athletes that they could be so attractive.
Now, getting Soviet women to compete more in the Olympics is obviously one angle. But I think what people forget, particularly nowadays, is the Olympics were supposed to be amateurs only. Professionals were not allowed to compete. But the Soviets thought they could bend the rules there.
Yes, and this is one of the main points of my book, and this was really a starting point for this book. My previous book was on the history of world ice hockey, and I was doing research for that book in the archives of the International Olympic Committee in Switzerland. And in the archive, I came across the documents from the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the Soviets were making their approaches to the IOC, inquiring about membership, inquiring about participation in the Olympics. And at that time, members of the International Olympic Committee were aware of the fact that Soviet sport was not amateur. And yet they were willing, one, the Soviets lied to the IOC and said, we will follow the rules. We will follow your rules in regard to amateurism. But the IOC was also willing to turn a blind eye to the ways that the Soviets were essentially gaming the system. And the background to all of this, as I said earlier, the Soviet Union had quite a vibrant sport culture already before the Second World War. And in particular, Soviet football was very popular. So Soviet clubs would draw tens of thousands of fans in the major cities. And the Soviet clubs were typically associated with a factory or with the military or the local police. And so, because football was so popular and because these factories and the military, they wanted to put the best possible club on the pitch, they would pay players. And the way they did this is they didn't pay the player, they didn't sign the player to a playing contract. Instead, the player was given a position with the factory or with the military. They were, on paper at least, they were an army officer, they were a factory worker, when in fact their real job was playing football. And they were paid well. So after the war in 1951, when the Soviet Union enters the International Olympic Committee, the IOC recognizes, okay, we know you've been paying your athletes in the past. This has to stop. And Nikolai Romanov, the head of the sport committee, says directly, oh, yeah, that's something we used to do, but we don't do that anymore. Our athletes are workers, they're students, and they do sport on the side. They follow the amateur ideal in the same way that British athletes did, in the same way American athletes did in the 1950s, right? This expectation that sport was not your full-time livelihood. That was the IOC's requirement. So Romanov says to the IOC, this is what we're doing, we're following the rules, when in fact the Soviets continued the system of paying athletes through the sponsoring factory, through the sponsoring military units, police units, and so forth. And in addition to that, one of the things that Romanov creates during the 1950s is a system where the sport committee is directly paying and providing bonuses to the top athletes in the Soviet Union, those who compete internationally. So when Soviet athletes start going to the Olympics in 1952 and 1956, they're being paid. Their full-time job is to train in their specific sport year-round. They receive a salary from the sport committee. And then if they receive a medal, they would receive a bonus from the sport committee. And the bonus would be anywhere from 1 to 2 times the average annual salary of a Soviet worker. So Soviet athletes were doing quite well in terms of their compensation. And this was at a time when the IOC required of athletes in the UK, in Western Europe, in North America, they required that they had to be strictly amateur. The rule at that time, or the rule in the 1960s, was that an athlete could not receive any kind of cash prize over $50. That would be a violation of their amateur status. The IOC said athletes cannot spend more than 2 weeks in dedicated training before the Olympic Games. That would be a violation of their amateur status. And meanwhile, at the same time, Soviet athletes were being paid handsomely, they were being paid bonuses, and they were preparing throughout the year in preparation for international competition.
Yeah, and the head of the IOC goes on a tour of the Soviet Union in 1954, and I'm presuming the Soviets just completely pull the wool over his eyes.
Yes. So The head of the IOC at this time was an American, Avery Brundage. He was the first former Olympic athlete to serve as president of the IOC. And Brundage is now something of a notorious figure in sport history for his, his support for the Nazis in the lead up to the 1936 Olympics, for his handling of the 1972 Olympics in Munich. So this is at the very beginning of Brundage's term as IOC president, his 20-year term as president. And he decides to go to the Soviet Union. He's invited to the Soviet Union by Romanov to see what Soviet sport is like. And as you said, the Soviets pull the wool over his eyes. They give him information. They talk about how many tens of thousands of athletes, millions of athletes who are participating in amateur sport, after work sport, after school sport, and so forth. And they bring him from one place to another, and you have these staged events. And Brundage comes away from the Soviet Union with this belief that sport in the Soviet Union is the true expression of amateur ideals, that Soviet citizens, from children to workers, students, and so forth, Soviet citizens participate in sport for simply the good of sport. They're not looking to earn money, to earn prize money, to win athletic scholarships. This was one of the things that Brundage particularly hated, was this emerging system of athletic scholarships in American university sport. They're simply participating in sport for their health, to help build community and build society. And so Brundage, after his return, he writes an article in what was the most popular magazine in the United States at the time, the Saturday Evening Post, praising the Soviet sports system as a model of amateur sport. And he does say the United States should follow what in the Soviet Union. He makes this point of American sport is too dedicated to profit, to athletes getting paid, and as he said, to spectators who are just sitting in the stands watching events rather than participating in events. And Brundage came away from his trip to the Soviet Union with this idea that the Soviets were indeed amateurs in their participation. Moreover, he comes away with something of a partnership with Soviet sports authorities. Soviet sports authorities recognized what Brundage hated was Western-style professional sport, what you saw in European football, what you saw in American sport. Brundage hated the system of scholarships in American university sport, and they joined him in condemning these varieties of sport and looking to root out any threat to amateurism that came from Western professionalism, while at the same time they were building up this system of Soviet state professionalism, which allowed their athletes to be paid.
The other countries who are competing against the Soviets, are they suspecting that everything is not right here? This isn't a level playing field?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in the archive collections of Avery Brundage, I found letters, newspaper clippings that sport officials, sports journalists in different countries were sending to Brundage. There are letters from Europeans, Americans, Canadians who traveled to the Soviet Union, and they gained a firsthand view, right? They didn't get the wool pulled over their eyes. They saw Soviet sport for what it was. And they would report on what they saw coming back. There were already in the 1950s athletes who were not from the Soviet Union, but athletes from the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, the satellite states, who were defecting to the West. And they were reporting because when the Soviets moved into the Eastern European states after the war, these states also adopted this Soviet-style system of state professionalism. All of this information is in Brundage's files. He was aware of journalist reports. He was aware of these reports from athletes who had defected. He was aware of these complaints from officials in sport. And he did this on his tour he made, and he presented a file of information to Nikolai Romanov and asked Romanov, what about this? What about all these reports we have that your athletes are being paid? And Romanov denied it. And throughout the years that followed, Brundage continued to send letters to Moscow, to the Soviet Olympic Committee, saying, we have these complaints that your athletes are not truly amateur. What do you say about this? And the Soviets would stall, the Soviets would deflect, and ultimately the Soviets would say, no, we've said they're amateurs, they're amateurs. And I talk about in the book how this reaches a point in the case of international hockey, for instance, where Canada, the country that had founded ice hockey, Canada leaves international hockey in the early 1970s because they recognize, in terms of at the Olympics, and I should say as well, in other international competitions, they followed the International Olympic Committee's rules on amateurism. So in hockey, for instance, the annual World Championships, teams had to follow these amateur rules. And the Canadians say, we can't compete against the Soviets. The Soviets spend more time training in hockey than explicit professionals who play in the National Hockey League in North America. So this is unfair. We want to change. The IOC doesn't allow us, so we're pulling ourselves out of the Olympics. Sweden as well pulled out of the Olympics. They realized they couldn't compete, and the IOC wouldn't force the Soviets to follow the rules. So yes, this is something that sport officials in other countries were well aware of, that Soviet athletes were being paid to train year-round.
And whilst Canada and Sweden had pulled out of ice hockey, the US remain in, and there's that iconic match in 1980, the Miracle on the Ice. Now, I'm not a big hockey fan, but I've heard of it. Can you explain the significance of this?
So this is this is my greatest sport memory as a child. So I grew up in the state of Minnesota, which, as many of your listeners know, is a frozen, ice-bound, far northern state. And hockey is very popular there. And as a boy, I was playing hockey. And so I have wonderful memories of listening to this match live on the radio with my father. And he and I, we just couldn't believe, as we were listening to the game, that the United States could beat the Soviet Union. And it was the case, and I talk about this in the book. The American hockey team that won, and the Olympics that year were at Lake Placid, New York. The American hockey team that won, this was a genuinely amateur team. The players had come directly from their university teams. They received just a bare stipend during the months that they were preparing for the match. They were together as a team for a matter of months, whereas the Soviet team had been together. The national team, many of its members had been playing together for a decade. The Soviet national team in hockey was constructed in a way that all of the players on the national team played on the same club team in the domestic Soviet League. So they would play a full season in the Soviet domestic league, and then they would go to the Olympics or to the World Championships. Already, they were a finely tuned machine, and they were playing under the club coach, was also the coach of the national team. So you had this unit that had been playing together not only for the entire season, but they'd been playing together for years. And they were professionals, right? They were being paid to train year round. And hockey players trained for 11 months. They had 1 month off. And this was the team that these American amateurs played. So it was miraculous. This is known as the Miracle on Ice. It was a miraculous victory in that you had a team of genuine amateurs. It was a young group of players against these Soviet professional veterans. So yeah, it was remarkable. And like I said, it remains one of my favorite sport memories.
How did the Soviets consider that the US had managed to create that win?
So there are a few documentaries that have been done by American media about the Soviet players' experience, the Russian players' experience of the Miracle on Ice. And these were done for the anniversary of the Miracle on Ice. They interviewed former players. And what these former players typically say when they're speaking to American media is that their coach, a man named Viktor Tikhonov, that he was just a ruthless tyrant who trained the players so hard that they were physically, mentally, emotionally exhausted. And then, moreover, during the match itself against the Americans, Tikhonov made a number of strategic blunders that caused the Soviets to lose. So this is the explanation that's given to American media. When former members of the Soviet team speak to Russian media, they give a completely different story. When they're speaking to Russian media, they say the Americans were doping. This is the only way that this team of 20-year-old university students could have competed for the full game against us, against the best team in the world, and won. And as one Soviet player said, I saw it in their eyes during the game that they were doped up. And this is the excuse that Tikhonov himself made to explain why his team lost in 1980, is this idea that the Americans were using doping, when in fact the Soviet hockey team had been using drugs in the past. In particular, we have it on record from one of the Soviet sports physicians that in the 1979 World Championships, the Soviet team had been using drugs.
Which brings us on to that subject, which most people look at as far as Eastern European competition is concerned during the Cold War. And Western countries were using doping as well. It wasn't solely a Soviet or East German thing. But when do the Soviets first look at using doping, and how do they research it?
Right from the start of the Soviets' preparations for international sport, for the Olympics, as these athletes are training, they're preparing for the Helsinki Games, there are reports from the Soviet archives of physicians giving, they were called nutritional supplements, they were called various enhancing medicines, things like this. So already from 1954, Soviet physicians, coaches are providing some type of pharmaceuticals to their athletes. Now, this is before steroids. So steroids enter the picture really after in the late 1950s. And the point you made that there were athletes in other countries who were using steroids, this is correct. And this is something the Soviets used as an excuse to justify their use of steroids with their athletes. And so steroids really began in the late 1950s. And one of the key figures in bringing about the development of steroids is an American physician and researcher who, and I tell this story in the book, he was at the 1954 weightlifting championships in Vienna. He was the team physician for the Americans, and he was having drinks with the Soviet team physician, and the Soviet team physician is pressing him over drinks. What do you give your boys? What are you providing to your boys? And it comes out in the conversation that the Soviet physician was giving the Soviet weightlifters injections of testosterone. And so this American physician, whose name was John Ziegler, he goes back to the States, and he was a weightlifter himself. He starts experimenting with injections of testosterone, and he finds that's not very effective. But at the same time, he had been working with a pharmaceutical company on the development of anabolic steroids. And in particular, he also would treat burn patients. So he was working on the development of steroids and their use with burn patients. And he thought, how about we use this synthetic form of testosterone and use it with weightlifters? And he finds right away that this brings an increase in the amount of weight that lifters are able to put up. And not only are they able to lift more, but they have more energy, they work out for longer, and he recognizes, aha. And Ziegler, in later interviews, he would say, I recognized, he also had a Cold War mindset, right? We were in a competition with the Soviet Union, therefore I wanted to give our athletes whatever advantage we could. Not only is our steroid use developing in the United States, but it's also developing in Western Europe, in the satellite states in Eastern Europe. So late 1950s, early 1960s, when athletes would gather together at international meets, they would be sharing pills. So at various athletics meets, the hammer throwers and the shot putters and the weightlifters, they're passing around pills. So the use of steroids begins to expand in the 1960s, especially by the late 60s. By the late 1960s, the Soviets recognize the use of these drugs is becoming more widespread, and they decide we need to investigate this. And so there was a team physician, again for the weightlifting team, a different person than in Vienna, whose name was Sergei Sarsania. And Sarsania, working with the Soviet weightlifting team, he decides to start a study through the Soviet Institute of Sport to find out the effectiveness of steroids. And they test steroids on athletes from basketball to biathlon, weightlifting, long distance runners. They were trying them on adult athletes as well as children. And they come up with this study, the results. It's released in 1972. It's only a few copies were made available, which talks about the reasonable use of steroids as a way to gain advantage of, and Sarsania emphasizes this in the study. We are competing in athletic competitions within this heightened arena of international conflict. So Sarsania recognized Soviet athletes compete within a political environment, a tense political environment. Therefore, Sarsania argues, we need to use every scientific advantage we have for our athletes to be successful. And so the Soviets began to emphasize the use of steroids, not just individual athletes. They began to implement a system across different sports that comes from, we can say, from the top down, seeing this as a way for Soviet athletes to gain advantage. And at the same time, and this brings us back to East Germany, right? They're watching athletes in the other satellite states using steroids and gaining advantages. And one of the things one of the things I discuss in the book is how the Soviet system of distributing and using these steroids is somewhat haphazard, whereas the East Germans, they create a well-executed, designed, effective method of using steroids to bring athletic success. And that begins to heighten tensions in international sport between these two socialist states, the Soviet Union and East Germany.
It's incredible how East Germany are nothing on the Olympic scene, and then from the 70s onwards just explode as this athletic superpower. And it is the drugs, but also I think they've also studied a lot more of the sports science as well. There's a scientific approach behind them. Yeah, it is the majority is the drugs there, but I think that there's a lot more investment in the sports science too.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And this is something in the course of my book, I talk about the contributions the Soviets have made to world sport. And one of the things they do, talked about women's sport earlier, but one of the other important things the Soviets bring to world sport is sports science and sports psychology. And this is something that gets carried from the Soviet Union to the East European satellite states. So you have already in the 1960s extensive studies that are being done on nutrition, on training, on development of young athletes by the institutes of sport research in the Soviet Union, as well as in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and other countries. And I make the point is that this brings about a transformation of world sport that we still have today. This idea that if you mix science and research with athletic training, you are going to produce better athletes. And for spectators like us, we see better performances.
What steps is the IOC taking? Because they know about this explosion of pharmaceutical advantage being taken. Are they comfortable with it and just accept it as part of the picture? And when do they actually take steps to try and prevent it?
So that's a good question. I should say as background, since the time of the Greeks, athletes have been coming up with different concoctions to give them an advantage in competition, right? So as long as there has been sport, there's been doping of some kind. So this is always something the IOC has been aware of. Initially, however, the IOC did not see this as threatening to athletes' health. Instead, it was a violation of the amateur code, right? So the IOC believed this notion that all athletes should participate in this spirit of sportsmanship and the spirit of fair play, and doping was violation of that code. And so the IOC, beginning in the 1960s, they began to make rules against doping, but they didn't yet have the science to engage in drug testing. And that doesn't really come about until the 1970s. And it's not until 1976 at the Montreal Summer Olympics that the IOC has a way of testing for the use of anabolic steroids. So meanwhile, the Soviets already, not only do you have Soviet scientists and physicians like Sarsania, not only are they trying to figure out what kinds of doses of which drugs give athletes the best performance, they're already thinking in terms of how do we have our athletes use these drugs and have them then pass the developing testing methods that the IOC is instituting. For instance, I talk about the famous Soviet weightlifter of the 1970s, Vasily Alexeyev, who listeners of my age will remember this just enormous bear of a man. He would wear these tiny red singlets. He had this big head of curly black hair, and he set record after record. He won Olympic gold medals throughout the 1970s. Strongest man in the world. He was just this feat of nature, this enormous man lifting enormous weights. He was also doped up on steroids. But Sarsania and others figured out ways for him to avoid detection. One of the early ways is that they would give him heavy doses of citric acid before he went through his doping tests, and that would wash the steroids out of his system. So Alexeyev would brag after he had the years of competing that all of his opponents, they were all doping, they couldn't match him, and he never failed a drug test. And he never failed a drug test because the Soviets were a step ahead during the 1970s in figuring out ways to make sure that their athletes tested clean.
The doping regime becomes more stringent towards the 80s. So you've got the Moscow Olympics, which effectively the drug testing is controlled by the KGB or controlled by the Soviets there. But then you've got the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics where the boot is on the other foot.
Yes, exactly. So during this period, testing was managed. So this is in the time before the World Anti-Doping Agency. It's not until the 2002 Olympics that WADA takes over control of doping. Prior to this point, the host nation was responsible for the testing regimen. So at the Moscow Games in 1980, the Soviet Sport Committee was responsible for doping testing. They handed the testing over to the KGB. And in this, they were following the model of the East Germans. The East Germans put their doping program under the control of the Stasi, the East German secret police. So the KGB has control of the doping testing. And athletes who would bring their vials of their urine for testing, the KGB would take it and they would give them a clean sample and say, this is your urine that you're going to hand in. And as a result, at the end of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, every athlete, Soviet and non-Soviet, tested clean. And the Soviets were able to brag that we have had the cleanest, fairest Olympics in history. So 4 years later, 1984, at Los Angeles, U.S. organizers, they are preparing their testing regimen, and they put the testing in the hands of university researchers, university chemists, who have a lab established on site in Los Angeles. And Soviet sports officials are thinking, okay, so in Moscow, we could have our athletes doped to the gills and the KGB just threw out their urine. What are we going to do in the United States in 1984? And I should say, and this is something I talk about in the book, is in the months leading up to, even in early spring 1984, Soviet authorities planned to participate in the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. So in other words, you have the boycott by the Americans and others in 1980. In 1984, you have the boycott by the Soviets and other communist states. But the Soviet decision to boycott in 1984 wasn't simply a tit for tat reprisal against the Americans in 1980. The Soviets had planned to participate, but one of the things that concerned them was, would they be able to compete? And they recognized that the use of performance-enhancing drugs was so important to their athletes, they had to figure out a way for their athletes to test clean. And the plan that the Soviets came up with, and this was just revealed in recent years by the New York Times, the plan the Soviets had was that they were going to bring a passenger ship, park it in Los Angeles harbor, and they asked permission from U.S. authorities and Los Angeles authorities, and they said, we just want to give our athletes a place where they can prepare, they can have their own meals, have their own trainers, physical trainers, and so forth, and then they'll go off the ship and they'll go participate at the venues in Los Angeles. What they didn't say is that they were also going to have a testing lab on the ship in Los Angeles harbor. Their athletes would have their urine tested to verify that their urine was clean, and then the athletes would go compete and turn in their urine for the official testing. So the aim of the Soviets is they wanted to avoid the embarrassment of having any of their athletes end up with a positive test. So they wanted to make sure everybody was testing clean. Okay. And ultimately, the American authorities put so many restrictions on this ship parked in Los Angeles harbor that the Soviets recognized this plan might not work. And that wasn't the only factor, but there were a variety of other factors. But this element with the inability for the Soviets to have their athletes doping and then testing clean, this we have to look at as one of the factors that causes the Soviets to back out of the 1984 Olympics. And the decision to back out was made only in May 1984, a couple months before the Games.
I found that really interesting because most people think it was just the tit for tat. But it obviously a significant part of that decision was the worry of their athletes being caught. And I guess the East Germans must have been really worried about that as well, because they were as reliant, if not more.
Not so much, because the East German scientists were better than the Soviet scientists at enabling their athletes to test clean. And this was one of I mentioned earlier, the tensions between the Soviets and the East Germans. And one point of tension between these two socialist countries is that the East Germans were better at doping science. They were better at the drugs they were giving their athletes, and they were better at figuring out ways for their athletes to test clean. And so it was the East Germans who were calling on the International Olympic Committee to have drug testing be internationalized at the Olympics rather than the host country. And this was before the 1980 Moscow Games. And Moscow authorities sent a strongly worded message to East Berlin saying, hey, comrades, you need to back off because you don't want to harm the interests of the Soviet Union. So the East Germans did not have the same fear as the Soviets did of getting caught. And moreover, the success of the East Germans, this was another factor that the Soviets were considering as they were preparing for the 1984 Summer Games. The East Germans had become so strong in international competition that the Soviet sport authorities, they were fearing, okay, one, what is going to happen if we lose to the Americans in Los Angeles? And what's going to happen if we lose to the East Germans at the Los Angeles Games? So this was the concern for Moscow, is the fear that going to LA, they would not have the same success that they had been used to for the previous decades.
Wow. Well, incredible. There is lots more in the book. We've covered up to the Moscow and Los Angeles Olympics of 1980 and 1984, but the book does continue to the present day. Do you want to just give a bit more of a flavor as to what we are leaving on the table for people so they will undoubtedly rush out and buy the book?
Yes. So the book is roughly half and half, looking at the Soviet period and then the post-Soviet period. And the connecting thread is this idea, which I talked about at the top of the interview, this notion that Moscow leaders had this idea from the very beginning of their participation in international sport that Russian athletes must win, that they must demonstrate the superiority of the Soviet system or the greatness of the Soviet state and now the Russian state. And this has led to now Russian sport authorities and political authorities engaging in various deceptions, engaging in various tactics to have their athletes gain an unfair advantage. For instance, the major doping program that was revealed in 2015 and 2016. And of course, another connection between the two parts of the book, the Soviet and post-Soviet part, is the person of Vladimir Putin. Putin was 19 years old in 1972 when the Soviets were competing in Munich. As I talk about in the book, as other people have talked about in the case of Putin, when he was a boy growing up in Leningrad, he was involved in judo. He saw sport, he saw judo as really important to building his character, as he said, but also it was important for just allowing him to defend himself in the rough neighborhood where he grew up. And so sport has always been important to Putin, and that's continued throughout his presidency. He was, right from his first year as president, he was actively involved in preparing athletes for the 2000 Summer Games in Sydney, the Sochi Games that Russia hosted in 2014. This was really a project about Putin. Putin put his prestige and his legitimacy on the line to gain the Winter Games for Russia. And so sport, not just the Olympics, not just international sport, but also domestic sport, has been a central part of Putin's political program.
You have been listening to Bruce Berglund, the author of The Moscow Playbook, How Russia Used, Abused and Transformed Sports in the Hunt for Gold. There's links in the episode information for you to buy the book and support the podcast. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.